With weapons that we don't use anymore. Maces are not as seen as often on the battlefield, although they are still legal. When I first joined the SCA, a mace was a piece of rattan with a couple layers of high shag carpet wrapped around it and taped. And some people would make them too soft, in which case you didn't notice them. And some people would make them too heavy, in which case they were dangerous. The standard being that you had to be willing to be hit by your own weapon before you were allowed to bring that weapon on the battlefield. One of the fighters, when we were a Principality, made a war hammer that he was very proud of, but he wasn't willing to let Hugh or me or Martin hit him with it. So he never got to fight with this weapon. And I think it's a good thing. It was just too much mass. Flails were popular when I first joined the SCA, but the problem with flails is you have a shaft and you have the flail portion of it, and if you block the shaft, then the flail comes around at a very high speed. And we found that if you made the flail so that it didn't damage a person, it was so light that it was like being hit with a marshmallow. And if you made it out of a regular piece of rattan, it came around so quickly that it damaged people. We just didn't want to have the sort of concussions that you would get from it, and there wasn't nearly as much medical information about concussions then. You simply said, no, that's too hard, you know, when your head rang. So the flails went away, and I think that's probably just as well. That was already part of the rules when I joined the SCA in AS9. So we'd have to go back to maybe Henrik of Hahn might be able to tell us with that, since he was there from the beginning. I don't know, that rule existed when I joined. Okay, well, let me step back. Polearms. My original polearm was a 9-foot, 4-inch long halberd with about 3 feet of blade, a couple small prongs on the side to catch a sword slipping down the blade, a thrusting tip, a butt spike, and 9 foot 4 inches long. And it was a very effective weapon. I didn't injure too many people with it. I did injure some, but we were still learning about things like chin straps and helmets. We didn't have a requirement for a chin strap and a helmet when I joined the SCA. And I'm probably the one responsible for that, because at an event in the Kingdom of the West, I nailed a person in the faceplate, and he was wearing a helmet that he'd gotten from another fighter, Paula Bellatrix, that had cheek pieces that were inserted to keep the helmet in place instead of a chin strap. Well, when I hit him with the polearm, I pushed the helmet into his face and chipped 3 teeth, which sort of, you know, it took some of the fun out of melee. And after that, after that event, one of the knights went to Paul, who was king, and said, "We should ban that weapon from the field." And Paul said, "No, we're just not used to fighting with it. There's nothing wrong with the weapon." And Paul appointed a commission led by Douglas Longshanks, and because I was the person who was doing most of the fighting with the polearm, he put me on the commission as well. And so I contributed my experience to Douglas's report, and Douglas reported saying basically the problem is with the helmets need to have chin straps in them fastened so that the helmet cannot be pushed onto the face. And so the armor was improved because of the weapon. If the weapon hadn't been brought onto the field, you know, certainly sooner or later someone else would have made a polearm and started thrusting blows with it as well as cutting blows. The long-range weapon that was regularly used. It was a glaive or a gisarm. You know, it had a thrusting tip, a blade, and a butt spike. Spears became a separate category when they reduced the maximum length of a pole arm with a cutting blade on it to 7.5 feet. And Kevin Peregrine was the Earl Marshal of the West when this was done, and Gregory of York sat in a marshalling class that he taught at Collegium probably about 2 years later. And he said, Kevin talked about how they had figured how much force was generated by a sword and the length of the sword, the weight of the sword, the arc, and tried to relate this to pole arms and came up with the 7.5-foot figure. But then Kevin said, and if you've ever been hit by Robert Dubois with his 9-foot-long pole arm, you can see why we reduced it to 7.5 feet. So, and then at that point, you started having, because spears with thrusting tips only were not reduced to 7.5 feet. They were left at 9 feet. And then we went through a period where 12-foot spears were allowed, and we had a brief period where spears of any length were allowed as long as it was a single piece of rattan. And one of Gregory of York's favorite memories is fighting with a 13-foot long spear at a war, and he was lent 2 spears. One was 15 feet long, one was 13 feet long, and he found the 15-foot long pole arm was too long for him to use effectively, but they had another fighter in Calafia named Tenar. Gregory used the 13-footer, and he gave the 15-footer to a fighter named Tenar in Calafia. And he told Tenar, I want you to keep track of how many people you killed. And Gregory said he had a great day with this 13-foot pole arm, and he remembered killing 23 people with it. And after the battle, he went to Tenar, and he said, so how many people did you kill? And he said, Tenar looked very grave. He said, I'm sorry, I lost track somewhere in the mid-20s. So Tenar killed between 25 and 30 people with this 15-foot long pole arm. Gregory killed over 20 with the 13-footer. The two of them together probably took out half of the opposing army. And then eventually it went back to 9 feet. And I don't know of a specific incident that caused it to be limited to 9 feet.